Section 16 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 8. The Governors of the City, Part 2. In the year 1285, the city again lost its franchise. Gregory de Rokesley was deposed from the mayoralty by Edward I for refusing to render any account of how the peace of the city was maintained, thus omitting to show proper respect to the king's justices at the Tower. For the next 13 years, London was governed by a warden appointed by the king, in the person of Sir Ralph de Sandwich or John le Breton. Sir Ralph de Sandwich is described in Letterbook A as warden of the city, as well as warden of Cordwainer Street. In 1297, a few months before the king restored the mayoralty to the citizens, John le Breton, who had for many years acted as the king's warden of the city in place of the mayor, is recorded as having summoned the aldermen and 6 representatives of each ward, and in their presence to have declared, inter alia, that the weighing machines for weighing corn at the mills should be abolished, and that bakers convicted of fraud should no longer be drawn on the hurdle, but suffer instead the punishment of the pillory. As soon as the citizens recovered their liberties and le Breton ceased to be warden, le Wheatley was again elected to the chair. The Charter of Restitution of the city's liberties bears date 12th of April, 26 Edward I, 1299, and it is preserved at the Guildhall. The particulars of the various stages of these proceedings are set out fully in the city's records. The writ was sent to the late warden on the 5th of April, and the notification to the citizens took place on the 9th. Le Wheatley was elected and admitted by the king at Fulham on the 16th. The king issued a writ to the barons of the Exchequer from York, notifying the restitution of the city's liberties, on the 28th of May, and a proclamation followed. The day after the mayor was sworn, he was compelled by business of his own to proceed at once to Lincoln, and during his absence, his official duties were committed to William de Betoine and Geoffrey de Norton. It is very important to bear in mind that the mayors of London, besides holding a very onerous office, were men of great distinction. They held rank outside the city, and naturally took their place among the rulers of the country. They were mostly representatives of the landed interest, as well as merchant princes, but sometimes, as already stated, the mayor sided with the populace in opposition to the views of his own compeers. Bishop Stubbs described the struggles between the magnates and the commons, and shows how Thomas Fitz-Thomas favoured the latter. Quote, in 1249, when the mayor and aldermen met the judges at the Temple for a conference on rights claimed by the Abbot of Westminster, the populace interfered, declaring that they would not permit them to treat without the participation of the whole commune. In 1262, Thomas Fitz-Thomas, the mayor, encouraged the populace to claim the title of communa civitatis, and to deprive the aldermen and magnates of their rightful influence. By these means, he obtained a re-election by the popular vote in 1263, the voices of the aldermen being excluded. In 1264 to 1265, he obtained a reappointment, but his power came to an end after the Battle of Evesham. End quote. To pass on to the 14th century, we learn that in 1326 Queen Isabel sent a letter to the citizens permitting them to elect a mayor, as in the days before the Eater of 1321. They elected Richard de Betoine, whom the barons had that day appointed warden of the Tower conjointly with John de Gisors. Sometimes the sovereign, when he went abroad, endowed the mayor with considerable powers for the preservation of peace. This was the case in 1340 when Andrew Aubrey, the mayor, acted on the authority of Edward III. A conflict had taken place in the streets of the city between the skinners and the fishmongers, which the mayor attempted to stop. John de Hansard, a fishmonger, brandishing a drawn sword, seized Aubrey by the throat and offered to strike him, while John le Brewer wounded one of the city sergeants. The delinquents were at once seized, carried to Guildhall, arraigned, found guilty, condemned to death, and beheaded in Cheap. When the king heard of this bold proceeding, he immediately wrote to the mayor, warmly approving of his conduct, congratulating him on his spirit, and adopting and ratifying the deed. Quote, Si vous en trouvons très bon gré et votre fait acceptons et les ratifions. End quote. Sir William Walworth, the most famous of mayors, died in 1385 after a full and strenuous life. He is said to have suppressed usury in the city, and we have seen how important a figure he was during Wat Tyler's insurrection. He was a prominent member of the Fishmongers' Company and improved the old church of St. Michael's, Crooked Lane, in which parish he lived, adding the Fishmongers' Aisle. Footnote: This church was destroyed in the Great Fire and rebuilt after the designs of Sir Christopher Wren. It was cleared away in 1831 to make way for the approaches to the new London Bridge. End of footnote. The end of the 14th century was, perhaps, the most stirring period in the history of the London municipality. There was a deadly feud between the leaders, who were men of strong character, endued with courage to carry out their views to the extreme. These feuds were no matters of merely local interest, but the incidents were followed with the greatest attention by the court and the whole country. The feuds arose from the increased power of the livery companies and the antagonism between the victualling and clothing trades. This division existed in most of the towns of the land, but the battle was fought out with deadly effect in the city of London. Walworth, a fishmonger, was the chief of the victualling party, but the two prominent leaders of the two parties were Nicholas Brember and John of Northampton. Doubtless the victualling companies had obtained a preponderating influence, and it is recorded that at one time 16 of the aldermen belonged to the Grocers' Company, of which Brember was a member. When John of Northampton, a draper, was elected mayor in 1381, in succession to Walworth, he set himself to crush the victualling party. The Act of Edward II having been evaded, another was passed in 1382, 6 Richard II, by which it was ordained that, quote, no victualler shall execute a judicial place in a city or town corporate. End quote. He forced Sir John Philipot, a public-spirited man and ex-mayor, but a friend of Walworth's and of the King's, to resign his aldermanry. On the 7th of November 1382, John Filiol, a fishmonger, was brought before the mayor and aldermen on a charge of having, quote, said that John Northampton, the mayor, had falsely and maliciously deprived the fishmongers of their bread. End quote. For this offence, Filiol was adjudged to be, quote, imprisoned at Newgate, in a place then called Boccardo, for 1 year then next ensuing, unless he should deserve more extended favour in the meantime. End quote. On the 6th of December, John Filiol, quote, was liberated at the instance of his friends, on the surety of William Naufreton and others. End quote. When the charge was made against Filiol, Richard Fiffide was one of those questioned on the subject, and he, quote, said that he and all the other fishmongers of London were bound to put their hands beneath the very feet of Nicholas Exstone, for his good deeds and words in behalf of the trade aforesaid. End quote. John of Northampton was mayor for 2 years, and had held the office of sheriff in 1377, MP for the city 1378. He was head of John of Gaunt's supporters, and a prominent follower of Wycliffe in London. He was leader of the party which sought to gain the favour of the populace, and he encouraged the citizens to set at naught the jurisdiction of their bishop. He would probably have been returned again in October 1383 as the champion of cheap food, if the king had not carried the election of Brember by force. Brember was the chief supporter of Richard II in the city, and he was the king's financial agent in 1381. He was first elected mayor in 1377, and at the Parliament of Gloucester in 1378, Thomas of Woodstock, the king's uncle, demanded his impeachment as mayor. From 1379 to 1386, Brember was one of the 2 collectors of customs for the Port of London, with Chaucer for his controller. He was MP for London in 1383. When he succeeded Northampton in 1383, he set himself to undo the evil caused by the action of his predecessor. Northampton was arrested in 1384 when returning from a riotous demonstration at Whitefriars. He was tried at Reading before the council over which the king presided. After a brief imprisonment, the condemned man was brought up for a fresh trial before Chief Justice Tressilian in the Tower of London and was imprisoned in Tintagel Castle, Cornwall. Brember was also opposed to Nicholas Twyford, who would probably have been elected mayor but for the high-handed proceedings of Brember. Twyford's party was confident of victory and shouted at the election, "Twyford, Twyford." But when the voting commenced, the soldiers placed by Brember behind the arras in the Guildhall rushed out and drove Twyford's followers from the building. Brember's party were allowed to remain, and they carried the election for their candidate. It is worthy of note that during Brember's mayoralty in 1378, Nicholas Twyford, one of the sheriffs, was brought up for contumacy towards the mayor and punished for the same. There had been a conflict in Cheapside between the goldsmiths and the pepperers, grocers, and John Wurzel, one of the sheriff's suite, was brought before the mayor as a principal mover in the strife. Twyford refused to do the mayor's behests as to the imprisonment of his follower after arrest. With the fall of the king, Brember also fell, and there was a revolution in the government of the city as well as that of the country. Northampton was released from Tintagel Castle and restored to his property, and Brember was tried for his life, condemned to death, and executed in the Tower in February 1388. The companies who petitioned for Brember's punishment were mercers, cordwainers, and 8 others, all opposed to the victualling trades. In 1387 a proclamation was made in the city by the king's command, forbidding, on pain of death and forfeiture of goods, all true lieges of London to speak evil of the king and queen. The issuing of this proclamation in the city formed one of the charges of high treason against Brember and his followers. In the same year, 1387, a book of civic regulations called Jubile, promulgated by John de Northampton and his party, was ordered to be burnt. Mr. Riley refers to the petitions in Parliament for 1386 to 1387, where we learn from the petition of the cordwainers against Nicholas Brember and his adherents that in this book of Le Jubile, quote, were comprised all the good articles pertaining to the good governance of the said city, and that Nicholas Extone, the mayor, and all the aldermen and good commons of the city had sworn for ever to maintain them, to the honour of God and the profit of the common people, but that the said Nicholas Extone and his accomplices have burnt it without consent of the good commons of the city, to the annihilation of many good liberties, franchises, and customs of the city. End quote. The feuds of those days continued to agitate the city for some years, but at last the differences between the various trades cooled down somewhat. In 1391, however, a proclamation was issued that, quote, no person shall speak or give his opinion as to either Nicholas Brember or John Northampton, end quote, on pain of imprisonment for a year and a day. The preamble is as follows, quote, whereas many dissensions, quarrels, and false reports have prevailed in the city of London as between trade and trade, person and person, because of divers controversies lately moved between Nicholas Brember, knight, and John Northampton, of late mayors of the same city, who were men of great power and estate, and had many friendships and friends within the same, to the great peril of the same city, and maybe all of the realm. End quote. The names of many other mayors who have conferred distinction on their office might be mentioned here, but the space at our disposal will not allow of any statement of the claims to honour of these men who have made their mark in the history of London. It is a curious fact that we have no authority whatever for fixing a date for the first use of the title Lord Mayor, and there can be little doubt that it was originally assumed without any positive right. Dr. Sharp thinks that possibly the expression Domino Major, strictly Sir Mayor, may account for the origin of the Lord Mayor's title. A claim has been set up for Thomas Legge, Mayor the second time in 1354, that he was the first Lord Mayor, but there is positively no authority whatever for this claim, although it is boldly stated that he was created Lord Mayor by Edward III in this year. One point is worthy of special attention, although it does not throw any actual light on the matter. Bishop Stubbs says that the Mayor of York was known as Lord Mayor in 1389. Richard II had, in that year, presented his own sword to the Mayor, who was thenceforward known as the Lord Mayor, and in 1393 he had given the Lord Mayor a mace. If this were so, we can scarcely believe that Londoners, who had always been very tenacious of their pre-eminent position, would be content to allow their chief magistrate to continue without a title possessed by the Mayor of York. Still, there is not the slightest evidence that the title of Lord Mayor was used in London at this early period, and it is possible that Bishop Stubbs' statement is too definite. There is no doubt that the title Lord Mayor was used at an early date in York, but the prefix Lord was not always applied, and as late as 1565 there is reference in the Chamberlain's account book, quote, to Mr. John Bean, Mayor, end quote. A correspondence of some interest was printed in the Times in November and December 1901 on this point, but although Legg's claim was disproved, few if any positive facts were brought forward. The most satisfactory letter was one from Mr. W. H. St. John Hope of the Society of Antiquaries, who, as a result of a search in the city books, gave some definite information as to the use of the title. Quote, down to about 1540, the chief magistrate was invariably styled Mayor. There are, however, instances as early as 1519 where he is referred to as my Lord Mayor, but seemingly in the same way as we speak of my Lord Bishop or my Lord the King, for the same entry that refers to him as my Lord Mayor now being, continues, as well as all other mayors his successors. After 1540, the use of the term Lord Mayor becomes general, e.g., 1542, every Lord Mayor's house, 1545, the Lord Mayors of the same city, 1546, the Lord Mayor, etc. End quote. We have seen how important was the office of Mayor in medieval times, and how like a king the holder's dignity was upheld. The Mayor has certain very remarkable privileges which prove the high esteem in which he was held by the sovereign. These privileges are of considerable antiquity, and have not yet been traced to their source. The four principal are: 1. The closing of Temple Bar to the sovereign. 2. The Mayor's position in the city where he is second only to the king. 3. His summons to the Privy Council on the accession of a new sovereign. 4. His position of butler at the coronation banquets. 1. The closing of Temple Bar to the sovereign. The gates of Temple Bar were invariably closed by the city authorities whenever the sovereign had occasion to enter the city. A herald sounded a trumpet before the gate. Another herald knocked. A parley ensued. The gates were then thrown open, and the mayor, for the time being, presented the sword of the city to the sovereign, who graciously returned it to the mayor. The earliest record of this custom is connected with Queen Elizabeth's visit to St. Paul's to return thanks for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but evidently the custom must be one of great antiquity, and probably in the case of the early kings it was carried out at one of the city gates long before the bars of the libraries were thought of, although no records have come down to us. Stowe's account of the proceedings in his Annals is as follows. Quote, over the gate of the Temple Bar were placed the waits of the city, and at the same bar the Lord Mayor and his brethren the aldermen in scarlet received and welcomed Her Majesty to her city and chamber, delivering to her hands the sceptre, which after certain speeches had Her Highness redelivered to the Mayor, and he again taking his horse, bare the same before her. The companies of the city in their liveries stood in their rails of timber covered by blue cloth, all of them saluting Her Highness, as she proceeded along to Paul's Church. End quote. 2. The Mayor's position in the city. None of the privileges connected with the Mayor's office has been so jealously guarded as the one upon which is founded the claim to the Mayor's supremacy in the City of London, where the sovereign only takes precedence of him. In Riley's Memorials, there is an extract from Letter Book 1, 1415, which refers to Henry V's speech on the contemplated invasion of France and the seat of honour accorded to the mayor, in presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's brothers. When these notables met together, diligent counsel was held as to the order in which they ought to sit, and, quote, the lords agreed together among themselves to the effect that the mayor, in consideration of the reverence and honour due to our most excellent lord the king, of whom he is the representative in the city, should have his place, when sitting, in the middle, and that the said lords of Canterbury and Winchester should be seated on his right hand, and John, Humphrey, and Edward on the left, upon seats arranged for them, these to make declaration on behalf of our said Lord the King. End quote. The actual right to preeminence was seldom challenged in the city, but there were certain places which were supposed to be outside the mayor's jurisdiction, such as the Inns of Court, where misunderstandings were frequently taking place. A very interesting instance is given in Gregory's Chronicle, and it is well worth quoting here for the striking light it throws upon the dignity of the office. Quote, this year, 1465, about midsummer, at the Royal Fest of the Sergeants of the Coif, the Mayor of London, Matthew Philip, was desired to be at that fest. And at dinner time he come to the fest with his officers, agreeing and according unto his degree. For within London he is next unto the king in all manner thing. And in time of washing, the Earl of Worcester was taken before the mayor and set down in the midst of the high table. And the mayor, seeing that his place was occupied, hilled him content, and went home again without meat or drink or any thonk, but reward him he did as his dignity required of the city, and took with him the substance of his brethren the aldermen to his place, and was set and served also son as any man could devise, both of signet and of other delicacies enow, that all the house marvelled how well all thing was done in so short a time, and prayed all men to be merry and glad it should be amended another time. Then the officers of the fest, full evil ashamed, informed the maisters of the fest of this mishap that is befall. And they, considering the great dignity and costis and change that longed unto the city, and anon send unto the mayor a present of meat, bread, wine, and many diverse subtleties. But when they that come with the presentes saw all the giftes, and the service that was at the board, he was full sore ashamed that should do the massage, for the present was not better than the service of meates was before the mayor, and throughout the high table. But his demeaning was so that he had love and thunk for his massage, and a great reward withal. And this the worship of the city was kept, and not lost for him. I trust that never it shall by the grace of God. End quote. Another and a later difficulty with the lawyers is recorded by Pepys on March 3rd, 1668 to 1669. In order to understand the cause of contention, it is necessary to bear in mind that within the city the mayor's sword was held up before him, but outside it was held down. Quote, meeting Mr. Bellwood, did hear how my Lord Mayor, Sir William Turner, being invited this day to dinner at the Reader's at the Temple, and endeavouring to carry his sword up, the students did pull it down, and forced him to go and stay all the day in a private counsellor's chamber, until the Reader himself could get the young gentleman to dinner, and then my Lord Mayor did retreat out of the Temple by stealth, with his sword up. This do make great heat among the students, and my Lord Mayor did send to the king. End quote. On Sir William Turner's complaint, the king agreed to have the case argued before him in council, but after hearing the evidence, his Majesty thought it best to suspend the declaration of his pleasure until the right and privilege should be determined by law, and apparently the question remains unsettled to this present day. A note may here be made of the mayor's position in the city as the chief of the military forces within his jurisdiction, with the right of forbidding the entry of troops without his sanction. Quote, the 3rd Regiment of Foot, raised in 1665, known by the ancient title of the Old Buffs, have the privilege of marching through London with drums beating, colours flying, which the city disputes, not only with all other corps, but even with the King's Guards going on duty to the Tower." End quote. Major R. Donkin, Military Collections. 3. The Mayor's summons to the Privy Council on the accession of a new sovereign. This is intimately connected with the claim of the city to a voice in the election of the king, which found practical expression even before the conquest. There can be no doubt that in medieval times the support of London was eagerly sought for in cases of disputed succession. During the 19th century, it was the custom to belittle the mayor and corporation, and Lord Macaulay in his history ignores the considerable influence of the city in securing the succession of his hero William III to the throne. At the councils held on the accession of Queen Victoria and King Edward VII, the respective Lords Mayor, although summoned, were not allowed to remain to the meeting of the council. Little has been written upon this very important privilege of the Lord Mayor, but its consideration opens up a very remarkable constitutional question which requires very careful investigation. There ought to be sufficient information available to settle the question. On the accession of His present Majesty, the Lord Mayor, the late Mr. Alderman Green, afterwards Sir Frank Green, Baronet, was invited to sign the proclamation immediately after the royal family, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor and his colleagues' signatures following his lordship's. It is said that the great Duke of Wellington laid great stress upon the attendance of the Lord Mayor, and it was supposed that as the death of the sovereign cancelled the appointments of court officials, the Lord Mayor, who continued in office, was an official of considerable importance on the occasion of the accession of a new sovereign. The continuance of court appointments is now settled by an Act of Parliament. 4. The Mayor's position at the coronation banquets. The privilege of assisting the chief butler at the coronations of the kings of England, accorded to the citizens of London, appears to date back before the appointment of a mayor. Dr. Sharp, referring to the double coronation of Richard I, writes, quote, "His first coronation had taken place at Westminster, 3rd of September 1189, soon after his accession, and the citizens of London had duly performed a service at the coronation banquet, a service which even in those days was recognized as an ancient service, namely, that of assisting the chief butler, for which the mayor was customarily presented with a gold cup and ewer. The citizens of the rival city of Winchester performed on this occasion the lesser service of attending to the viands. The second coronation, taking place at Winchester, 17th of April 1194, and not at Westminster, the burgesses of the former city put in a claim to the more honourable service over the heads of the citizens of London, and the latter only succeeded in establishing their superior claim by a judicious bribe of 200 marks. End quote. Andrew Bockerell, mayor in the year 1236, 21 Henry III, claimed to serve as butler at the coronation of Eleanor, daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Provence, Queen of Henry III, but his claim was set aside on this occasion by the king's command. In the remarkable record of the Court of Claims held before the coronation of Richard II, over which John of Gaunt presided as High Steward, the claim of the mayor and citizens is fully set forth. The king, quote, willed and decreed that the citizens of the said city should serve in the hall of Bottelry, helping the chief butler, while the king himself sat at table on the day of his coronation. And when the same our Lord the King, after dinner, entered his chamber and asked for wine, the said mayor should serve our said Lord the King with a bowl of gold, and afterwards should receive that bowl with the ewer appertaining to the same bowl, as a gift from the king." End quote. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. End of Section 16.